Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lee Page at PVA, and we are having a webinar on autonomous electric vehicles are the future. We're going to wait a little while before we start as participants slowly file in. We'll wait just a couple minutes more. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Again, my name is Lee Page. Welcome to our webinar on autonomous electric vehicles. Are they the future and how will they be accessible? Next slide, please. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing on the PVA website at pva.org. Closed captioning is available, so click the CC button on the webinar. Control bar at the bottom of your screen to turn it on. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and questions will be answered at the end of the program. Next slide. So to do introductions, we've got 3 dynamic speakers for our webinar today. First is Henry Claypool. Henry is a consultant with the American Association of People with Disabilities. He's a technology consultant and heads up the We Will Ride initiative coalition group, which PVA is a member. In that role, he works to advocate for technology and accessibility in autonomous vehicles for the future for disability access. Our second speaker will be Alan Hale. He's an accessibility strategy manager with General Motors, where he's working with GM to look at accessibility in the GM product line, and also co-president of GM Able, which is the global looking to outreach to people with disabilities as employees for GM globally. And then our final speaker is Josh Shore, an accessibility specialist at the Access Board. As you know, Access Board does all the technical standards for accessibility, and they're talking about the EV chargers and autonomous vehicles today. And then finally, Heather will be here to do question and answers at the end of the program. So next slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to Henry for his remarks.
Thanks, Lee, and thank you all for coming today. And glad we have an opportunity to talk about 2 really important issues, electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. So I'll be covering autonomous vehicles, and I wanted to start with talking about some distinctions that we can make about autonomous vehicles. There's levels of autonomy. There are cars that have driver assist features that operate at the lower levels of autonomy. That would be like a Tesla that has the capacity to, provide quite a bit of support for the driver, but it doesn't drive on its own. And you always have to keep your hands at the ready position and able to steer the vehicle or respond to appropriate road conditions. So you have other driver assist features that we're seeing introduced in cars all the time. Lane finding capability that keeps you in your lane, automatic braking that prevents collisions when it's got a detectable object and it can slow the vehicle. And I think we're all familiar with kind of cruise control, and that has become even more refined and now allows cars to really kind of keep pace with traffic. So those are all kind of semi-autonomous or driver assist features that operate at these lower levels of autonomy. At the higher levels, you actually have a computer system, an autonomous driving system that is taking responsibility for the driver. It's basically a computer in the place of the human that's driving the vehicle. And those would kind of be distinguished. These aren't that important, but kind of level 4 and level 5 vehicles are these higher levels of autonomy where cars are capable of driving themselves. Just an important distinction there is that this level 5 vehicle is one that no longer has the traditional controls. So no steering wheels, pedals for controlling the vehicle. And so those vehicles, we see prototypes developed by automakers, but we don't really see them on the road yet. So we're seeing these vehicles with a full set of controls that are operating with an autonomous driving system, doing most of the real important legwork right now, which is logging the miles, demonstrating that they can operate safely, making sure that they can basically sell to the public that autonomous vehicles, somebody are going to be capable of driving themselves and that they can operate as safely or safer than a human being driving a car. So that's been the focus at AAPD. We are really seeing an opportunity here to work at these very early stages to reach out to automakers and the companies that are building these autonomous vehicles to engage with them to make sure that accessibility is thought of first, and so that these would basically be built accessible from the ground up. It's a challenge, as you all know. Most of the vehicles, if not all of the vehicles on the market, are built and sold and only made accessible through aftermarket modification, which is really expensive. I don't have to tell the PVA audience about what entailed there. So that's why it's been important for AAPD to do this work, is hopefully there are some cost efficiencies that we can bring to this process by thinking about building an accessible vehicle first. And just to layer on a couple of important points about what you would expect to see in the early stages of these autonomous vehicles. They'll operate in a ride-sharing model. You'll order them as a transportation as a service, much like a Lyft or an Uber through an app. And they would, these wouldn't be for direct sale to consumers. For a couple of reasons, the vehicles are pretty expensive right now. And so I'm not sure that there's a really strong market to pay for these. And then on top of that, we've got early stage technology that needs to be maintained, and that can best be done by operating in this mode of having a fleet of vehicles, basically called robo-taxis sometimes in the press, that are going out and providing rides. So that's what we should all expect to see. If you happen to live in the East Valley of the Phoenix area, you've seen Waymo vehicles driving around the area there and giving people rides. But again, our work at AAPD is being done through our We Will Ride initiative. And again, we're reaching out to automakers and to the autonomous vehicle companies to really engage them. We take a cross-disability approach in our work, and that means that we're advocating for all populations. I think some of the challenges around making the vehicle accessible to blind and deaf people, people with sensory disabilities, the technology exists to make that possible. It's a little more of a adaptation. How do you build these features into the vehicle? I think where we get into some real challenges is around the physical accessibility. And again, back to the story of modifying vehicles aftermarket. They haven't historically been built to be accessible, and therefore building a physically accessible vehicle that can accommodate a wheelchair basically is a big design challenge and something that automakers are wrapping their heads around in all different quarters. So it's been great to have conversations with them. We know that there's lots of work to do, and there, again, is a huge opportunity here. Beyond just thinking about the physical accessibility of the vehicle, there are a couple of issues there that I would just run through that you might already be identified with, which is, getting in and out of the vehicle, the doorway height and clearance, the ramp slope. So anyone that's entered into a modified vehicle is familiar with this. These are issues that accommodate most wheelchairs, but probably not all. And certainly scooters might have a more difficult time, say, navigating certain interior spaces in vehicles. So their work remains to be done on kind of the design of the vehicle and the interior and how best to accommodate a wheelchair. So lots of work there for automakers and the AV companies that are offering a service to make sure that they're putting a vehicle into service that can accommodate people that need to ride in their wheelchairs while in transit, which leads to a pretty significant challenge, which is the issue of wheelchair securement and passenger restraint. Again, those of you that have ridden in the vehicle know that getting positioned and strapped in can be challenging or difficult. Not all the belting systems work the same. They don't fit in a uniform way to a wheelchair. So there's a pretty significant conversation going on right now about developing a universal securement device that would would fit onto basically any wheelchair, and then allow that chair to be secured, and then have a belting system that would restrain the passenger as well. So that is a significant challenge. Lots of work to do there, not only with the automobile manufacturers, but the wheelchair manufacturers, all the interests that are involved there, and certainly those of us that use chairs. How is it that we are going to be accommodated in this process? And is the design of a universal securement device going to work well for all the different types of chairs that are out there? So that's a big topic of discussion in most of our conversations with the automakers. I would say, just quickly to talk about our We Will Ride initiative, what we do is convene meetings with different automakers and companies that are offering these services. And I'll use one example of a meeting with Volkswagen back in 2019, where we convened a large number of stakeholders, and that included representatives from the federal government, not there in a kind of formal capacity, but there to give some perspective on how they see wheelchairs being accommodated in a vehicle that has been purpose-built to be accessible and that's going to drive autonomously. So the wheelchair securement was at the center of that topic, but it was great having wheelchair manufacturers there talking about design considerations. We even had the FDA there, since they're really responsible for wheelchair safety, and all they test the chairs for is, will they hold a certain weight capacity? And they're not requiring wheelchairs to be manufactured to be crash tested or crash resistant or anything of that nature. So we do have a lot of work to do around this issue, but I know that PVA has been leading the way on access to airliners for wheelchair users. And we think there's some great work that's being done there, and that research will inform some of the work that we're doing around autonomous vehicles.
Sure.
So we, again, in our We Will Ride initiative, hold regular meetings where we bring these different companies in. They meet with people participating in our process, like PVA, the National Council on Independent Living. We have the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund that attends. We have the blind groups, NFB and ACB are often there, and United Spinal is a participant. So we've got a good group of people that come and for informal discussion to engage these folks, to really support them and encourage them to build accessibility into their product design from the earliest stage possible. We think that's essential to these, to realizing the vision that the industry has laid out there for us. They've said that autonomous vehicles are going to be super beneficial to people with disabilities and older adults. Well, those of us that use wheelchairs know what a challenge it is to get access to reliable transportation. And so we're eager to engage and often raising issues. I'm just aware of our time. I know we've got other panelists, and I think I can pass it off here and look forward to more discussion later.
Great. Thank you very much, Henry. That's a ton of good information and a good way to start the conversation. At this point, we'll turn it over to Alan, who's with GM, and we'll hear from him.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks, Henry. So a lot of our story at General Motors really is similar to what Henry was talking about, of questions to the industry of what's going to happen for accessibility. And for us, a lot of our story starts with GM Able, which is our employee resource group for people with disabilities at GM. So that'll be a little bit of what I'll talk about today. If you can go to the next slide. So I'll really tell the story of GM Able and how General Motors is on our path of really listening to our employees with disabilities as we're in the middle of a transformation in our industry for electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, EV charging, and everything under the sun that's happening in the automotive right now. Really listening to those employees. And then I'll talk about really how we're building the ethos in our business, that not only is this the right thing to do, but as a company and as a business, it's also going to make financial sense in the long run. And it's something I think everyone on this call knows. Disability is just so vast and a part of human life that it's foolish, I think, to leave it behind. And then something exciting I'll end with is really talking about what we're doing with our new Accessibility Center of Excellence at GM, and hopefully ways that folks can get involved. Next slide. So one of my favorite quotes from our CEO, Mary Barra, kind of right as we were really starting our journey to building disability inclusion into our business, was, "We aspire to be the most inclusive company in the world, but it's not a title we want to hold by ourselves." And I think it talks a lot to the work that General Motors has done with companies like with groups like We Will Ride, and other companies and groups who are also advocating for vehicle accessibility. This is a rising tide, I think, that we need in our industry right now. Next slide. So just to give folks a little snapshot of myself and my accessibility matters to me, I'm the accessibility strategy manager at General Motors, kind of helping start a new group in our company to help focus on bringing accessibility to our products in every capacity we can. I also serve as the co-president of GM Able, which is our employee resource group for people with disabilities at GM. I myself have some invisible disabilities, and you can see pictured here is my wife, who is a manual wheelchair user. Outside of work too, I've dedicated to working in the city of Detroit and the state of Michigan, of really helping promote accessibility in kind of every layer of our community. So it's something that I really enjoy, and I've kind of brought that energy to General Motors with me. Next slide. So for folks that don't know what an employee resource group is, GM Able is actually one of the oldest employee resource groups focused on disability in the US. A lot of companies have them, but we're really here to drive that culture of inclusion, to really bring that customer lens, support our employees, and build community through innovation, talent enrichment, awareness, and outreach. And we've been growing quite a lot through COVID. I think in 2020, we had 200 members, largely based in the US. And today we have close to 1,200 members, and that's throughout the globe, South America, China, Korea, Canada, Mexico, you name it. And we're really here to support our employees through bringing that customer lens to a lot of the groups at GM that are working on design and engineering. But we're also here to provide that backbone of culture of, if you're an employee who comes in with a disability to GM, we're a support network, and we're kind of the fixers who can help make sure that everyone can thrive. Next slide. So something that was really foundational in our journey of starting to ask questions of, will electric vehicles be accessible for us? Will autonomous vehicles be accessible for us? A lot of this drives from our DEI efforts in the company as well. So when we look at business case for inclusion, we know from studies like Deloitte publishes, companies are 2 times more likely to exceed financial targets, 3 times more likely to have high-performing individuals, 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. Next slide. And when we think of disability, we really bring that disability is the largest minority group. And this is not just in the US, but the globe. So when we look at global population, it's over 1 billion people. When we look at the population in the US, it's 26% of our population. The CDC tracks as 1 in 4 Americans have a disability. Added to that are temporary disabilities. Added to that are also caregivers. So when we think of really the community around people with disabilities, and then we know that this is only going to grow as we have an aging population. These numbers go up with age, and we know that is rapidly increasing as we look ahead to the future. I think Henry touched on it earlier, that disability is really intersectional, and it's also, there's a wide range of disabilities. So when we look at the spectrum between cognitive disabilities, vision disabilities, deaf and hard of hearing disabilities, motor disabilities is the one I think we're all familiar with here, but speech disabilities are a part of that too. This becomes a real opportunity for us to look at the range of products and services we have ahead of us. Next slide. And not only is it the right thing to do, but again, it makes business sense for us. And that's where we're really driving this culture of ethos that when we look ahead to the future of autonomous vehicles, this is going to be viable for us to focus on. So the general studies here, there's a great study from Accenture called the Disability Inclusion Advantage. And it really proves companies that focus on accessible design have higher revenues, have higher net income, have higher profit margins. Globally, it's quantified as an $8 trillion market. And that includes people with disabilities across the globe, plus their close friends and family who make all their purchasing decisions around that. And then in the US, from the American Institute of Research, is a great study that quantifies it here as $490 billion market, with one of the highest discretionary incomes of any minority group. So when we think of disability, again, it's not only the right thing to do, but it makes sense. And that's where we're really targeting the ethos of our business at GM to support this as we create new ideas to support accessibility. Next slide. So there's a lot of ways we've started to really drive this into the business and starting to get word out more of what we're up to. Next slide. So we do celebrate kind of our key milestone holidays through the year with Global Accessibility Awareness Day, Disability Pride Month, where we even had the Disability Pride Month flag on the Renaissance Center in downtown Detroit. Coming up soon is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, where there will be more stories to tell. And then something we're really excited with our growing global community is International Day of Persons with Disabilities. Next slide. So all this is a lot of the ethos that we've driven into General Motors. I'd say many of our leaders have seen this information. A lot of people get it, and we just pick up allies throughout our company all the time. And these 3 bullets are really what we leave as a takeaway whenever we do these kind of talks internally at General Motors. But it's really driving that conversation about nothing about us without us when we think about disability, of we need more people with disabilities at General Motors, helping us hire, helping us design, helping us decide what goes in and out of that future autonomous vehicle. Because to Henry's point, these challenges would be a lot easier if we had leaders with disabilities calling the shots. So that's something we're always mindful of as a company. This is a system of a reason we don't have a purpose-built accessible vehicle today is because we just haven't had the people to do it. So we're looking to change that. And then that leads to kind of the day-to-day accountability of we also need to work to remove barriers in our space to make sure General Motors can always be welcoming to people with disabilities. And then our tagline, again, from Mary Barra, is the world is changing right now. And we're all working together to find those gaps that can help General Motors become the most inclusive company in the world for people with disabilities and make sure that we're building that into our products and services. Next slide. So this is kind of the journey that's led to us starting the Accessibility Center for Excellence. And hopefully I'll be able to come in the future after we've gotten our footing a little more at General Motors and have a more robust and kind of public route to share what we're working on. But I can share, we do have this vision to help GM become the most trusted accessible mobility company in the world. And we're doing this through 4 key pillars of really building the pipeline of innovation. So making sure we have voice of the customer in our process so that people with disabilities are represented as we're designing things 5 to 8 years in the future. Making sure that there's that voice in our business is vital to making sure that everybody understands why accessibility matters. And then having the pipeline that carries that voice over to innovation. We need that bridge that brings things into products and services that become something outside of paper to something that's real and is going to hit the market. So products and services is really getting that roadmap so that we can deliver to our customers with disabilities. And then aftermarket is really important. And I think it's one that we're not going to have all the answers today, but we can work with some partners who are working on those answers. So folks like the upfitters, folks like accessories manufacturers, making sure that we're covering the needs today is also really important to that journey. And then the last one is maybe one of the most important to me is building an ecosystem that lasts. So making sure that while we're talking about how much disability inclusion matters in our products, making sure that we've got the voice of people with disabilities, making sure that we're looking long-term and working across the company to make sure that we have this pipeline for decades to come. So I think that's the exciting part of having the catcher's mitt for all the advocacy that Henry and others on this call are doing, and that there's someone at General Motors who's listening and turning that into a business objective. Next slide. So one thing I wanted to finish on today was an opportunity to get involved with us. So we've got really exciting, we're working with a research partner of General Motors, RDS, is hosting a concept screening panel for us that's set to go through the end of the year. And it's a way to really have a voice and getting to see some early design concepts at GM and getting a chance to, both through surveys and direct interviews, having a voice again in our innovation process. So there's a link here with a password mobile. Please register, and if you qualify, we'd love to hear from you.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, Alan. That's a lot of good information. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Josh now.
All right. Thank you very much, Lee. I'm Josh Shore. I'm an accessibility specialist from the US Access Board, and I'm here to present a short presentation on accessibility for electric vehicle charging stations and autonomous vehicles. The Access Board is a tiny federal agency that has been tasked with developing the minimum federal standards for accessibility and providing technical assistance on the ADA, which is most of the same requirements as it is for a federal facility with a few differences. But let's talk about start off by talking about electric vehicle charging stations. So EV charging stations guidance. Absent a specific reference to EV charging stations in the ADA and ABA standards, regulated entities must still ensure that they are accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. So we do cover that an EV charging station, they do need to provide accessible ones, but there's nothing specifically in the ADA about charging stations themselves, just because they did not exist when the ADA was written. But the board has issued design recommendations for accessible EV charging stations just this past July, not even a month ago. And that's nearly 40 pages of recommendations that we've put out. Next slide, please. So EV charging stations coverage. These are the stations that are going to be covered under either the ADA or ABA, and those are going to include ones installed at state or local government offices, public parks, municipal building parking lots, on-street parking in the public right-of-way, public EV charging stations provided by a private entity, fleet charging stations used by the federal government, commercial fleet charging stations available to corporate clients, and rest stops along the interstate highway system. So all of these locations need to provide, if they are providing EV charging stations, need to provide at least one accessible EV charging station. Next page, please. So EV charging station requirements. So these are the requirements from the current existing minimum accessibility standards that do apply to EV charging stations. Those are going to include any operable parts on the charging station, and any operable parts are going to require a clear floor or ground space in front of it and being within reach range and usable. That also includes things like not requiring more than 5 pounds of force to operate. The EV charging station itself needs to be connected along an accessible route. And it's required to have accessible communication features. When we're talking about the technology side of communication features, we only have specific requirements under 508, which is a federal requirement. Otherwise, we just say it has to be accessible. But if these developers, manufacturers are designing these EV charging stations that they're obviously going to want to sell, lease, or get funded by federal government, then they're going to need to make them 508 compliant, and they're not going to make a separate inaccessible one just to have it be inaccessible. So some of those technology components are things such as display screens, input controls, and keys or cards or fobs, some sort of interactive element with the device. And also under the ADA and ADA, we do have fair machine requirements. So if they're going to start treating them like fair machines, there are requirements that would apply. Next slide, please. So that's it for the current existing requirements. So now we're going to go over EV charging station recommendations. That's part of this document we released last month. We have recommendations for the vehicle space design. We based a lot of this off of the requirements for parking spaces. And in particular, we based it off of van spaces for its size, because that will get you the size and the access aisle so that a person is able to exit their vehicle, perhaps go around the vehicle, depending on where the location of the charging port is, get to the charger, and then plug it into their vehicle. So there's obviously a lot of space requirements that are going to be needed for that. We do have recommendations for signage indicating which machines are accessible. And we even have some sort of proposal for some sort of use last situation in case they want to install just a few machines and have one that is accessible, but can also be used by everyone. We recommend that the charging stations be installed at ground level instead of on a curb, and that will greatly aid in everything being within reach. And where these charging stations should be located on a site. And that's it for EV charging stations that we currently have covered. So now, next slide, we will move on to autonomous vehicles. So these are the level 5 autonomous vehicles that Henry was talking about. These are the fully automated ones, no drivers, no steering wheels. So these are going to be fleet vehicles. They're going to be covered by DOT under 49 CFR Part 37. And that means that they're going to be subject to the technical guidance in the ADA accessibility guidelines for transportation vehicles. And within the ADAG for transportation vehicles, the most relevant portions are going to be in subpart B, which is buses, vans, and systems. And there are different requirements within that, depending on whether the vehicle is greater or less than 22 feet. A lot of these ones that are being designed seem to be right around that 20-foot range, but there are obviously ones like this image on the left, which is going to be a bit longer than 22 feet. The U.S. Access Board has developed an updated ADAG for buses and vans, which provides additional accessibility requirements, such as a less steep slope requirement for ramps, just as one example, but those have not been adopted by DOT. But when they do get adopted by DOT, they will be applicable to autonomous vehicles. Next slide, please. So autonomous vehicle accessibility. These are what is required of accessibility for these vehicles. There needs to be mobility aid accessibility, and that's going to include a level change mechanism or boarding device, such as a lift or a ramp. There needs to be some sort of securement for common mobility aid devices, such as scooters or wheelchairs. And there has to be maneuvering clearances so that a person in a wheelchair can actually get to the securement area. There are requirements for the doors, steps, and thresholds, requirements for any priority seating signs. There are requirements for the interior circulation handrails and stanchions, lighting requirements, and then where provided, fare box and designation and route sign requirements. Next slide. So starting with autonomous vehicle boarding and exiting. So when entering or exiting a vehicle, there needs to be at least one means of accessible boarding and alighting. Any of these can be ramps or bridge plates, lifts, level boarding, But whatever it is, at least one means needs to be able to deploy to the roadway. So they're going to need to have some sort of lift or ramp, because a bridge plate or a level boarding isn't going to work with the roadway. Next slide, please. So specifically about ramps for autonomous vehicles. They are permitted to fold or telescope. The surface must be continuous and slip resistant. There is a minimum clear width and edge guard requirements so that people in wheeled devices are not going to fall off. There are slope requirements, and these slope requirements are different depending on where the ramp is being deployed to. There are different slope requirements, whether it is ground level or whether it's being deployed to a curb. And then if it is being deployed to a curb, what the distance of the vehicle floor is above said curb. And then finally, it has to be marked with a high contrast band of color that's going to run the full width of the boarding edge, although we highly recommend the entire surrounding edges be marked with this high contrast color. Next slide. And autonomous vehicle lifts. So any lifts that is going to be part of the vehicle is going to need to comply with NHTSA's FMVSS 49 CFR 571.403 and 571.404. And that's a lot of just technical requirements for lifts so that they're safe enough to be attached to a vehicle and on the road. There are additional accessibility requirements that we have as well. And these include emergency operation. So if there's some sort of power failure, you can still get out of the vehicle. There needs to be platform barriers so that nobody's able to just slip off the side. People need to be able to board or exit either facing forward or away from the vehicle. They can't be forced to back up onto the ramp or forced to approach from a forward direction. And these ramps need to be used by standees, most likely people that are ambulatory or semi-ambulatory that are going to require or use a cane or a walker, something where they would benefit greatly by having this vertical access provided. Next slide, please. The doorways for autonomous vehicles do have a minimum vertical clearance. That clearance is measured from the finished edge of the door opening to the highest points of the deployed lift, ramp, or bridge plate below. There are different height requirements depending on whether the vehicle is greater or less than 22 feet. So if it is greater than 22 feet, it's going to have a higher door height requirement. But regardless of the height of the door, the thresholds for said door need to be marked with another high contrast band of color that's going to run the full width of the threshold. Next slide, please. So for the maneuvering and securement, there does need to be wheelchair securement. And if it's under 22 feet, it can be facing forward or backwards. If it's over 22 feet, it's going to be forward only. It needs to be able to secure common wheelchairs and mobility aids. And because these are fully automated vehicles, the securement device itself has to be automated as there is no employee on hand for securement. There needs to be sufficient turning and maneuvering space to permit passenger using a wheelchair to reach securement location from the lift or ramp. And the route must maintain a minimum interior height so that a person can go from the ground, up the ramp, through a door, and to the securement area for their device. And finally, there are requirements for handrails and stanchions. There needs to be handrails and stanchions provided at the vehicle entrance. And these are configured in a way so that a person from outside the vehicle can grasp them to help during the boarding process. And any interior circulation path needs to be provided with handrails and stanchions that permit onboard circulation, seating, and standing assistance, while also still being clear of the maneuvering space needed for any wheeled devices. Next slide, please. Finally, there's illumination requirements. The illumination requirements are going to be basically for both stepping onto the vehicle and the ground immediately outside the vehicle. And so because it's going to have these outward lights on the ground, that the lights do need to be shielded so that they don't project directly into the eyes of passengers or anybody just happens to be on the street. And these are going to be required at stepwells and doorways, and there are minimum illumination requirements. And that is about all that is currently covered under AV vehicles. If you want to see any of our guidance or recommendations, they're available on our website at www.access-board.gov. If you have any questions, feel free to call us on our phone line, 202-272-0080, extension number 3, or feel free to email us at ta@access-board.gov. Thank you.
Great, Josh. Thanks very much for that presentation. We've got a resource page, as Josh just mentioned, some resources for the Access Board specifically, but we also have some resources from AAPD, their most recent automobile accessibility scorecard, their autonomous vehicles roadmap. We've got the NCD report on self-driving cars, as Josh mentioned, the Access Board autonomous vehicles, CCV principles on autonomous vehicles. And then I've got a couple resources from GM Able accessibility, then also driving electric vehicles at GM. And then they've got the electric Hummer. I thought you guys might be interested in seeing what an electric Hummer looked like. So those are some resources and websites you can look at, for further information. At this point, I think we're ready to turn it over to Heather for questions and answers.
Well, thank you to all of our presenters for that great information that you shared with us today. We do want to take some time now to go through and provide some answers, hopefully, to questions that you might have. And one of those questions is we talked about a requirement for there be in a fully autonomous vehicle, there should be a way to have the wheelchair be secured, even if there's not an individual, a human who's on the board who is an employee working that device. So is there anyone who can answer, how can a wheelchair, are there ideas about how a wheelchair can be independently secured in an AV situation? Are those available now, or is that something that will need to be invented?
I can speak a little bit to that. So actually we did a series last year of different panels about how to accomplish autonomous vehicles, and a large part of that did focus on securement. We have these videos uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you just Google Access Board, you'll find our YouTube channel. But we have a whole 4 sections about autonomous vehicles, and some of those presentations, like hour-and-a-half long presentations, do cover how to actually go about securing mobility devices. These are things that are actively being worked on. I don't think any have made it to market quite yet, but these are being actively created, worked on, and studied.
Yeah, and Heather, I can kind of elaborate on that. The University of Michigan has a Transportation Research Institute, and they've done quite a bit of work on wheelchair securement and passenger restraint in vehicles. So all of that research really does inform this question about how does a chair independently secure itself when somebody's really not able to, move to attach the securement system or even grab the belting system. So the challenges are significant, and this is a work in progress. there is a design of something called the UDIG, the Universal Design. I've forgotten exactly what the acronym means, but it's an attachment that would fit onto chairs and then would be mate with a mount that's in the vehicle. So that's a very rough design that wouldn't yet be able to be attached to every wheelchair type. And so there is still, I think, quite a bit of back and forth between the developers of the wheelchair manufacturers and all of the stakeholders that are interested in building this wheelchair securement system that cannot be operated independently. So much work to do there.
Well, thank you, Henry and Josh. We have a sort of a follow-up to that, which is our wheelchair manufacturers. First, are we anticipating that anything will need to be done to modify wheelchairs and scooters to allow them to be secured with these systems? And then will wheelchair manufacturers be required to do that? So is there anything that would need to be done to the chairs or scooters themselves?
I would just quickly open, and maybe others can elaborate, but I don't think that it's really possible to require right now under the current rules for manufacturing wheelchairs to require them to be built in a way that would be accessible for transportation purposes. These are built, again, under the jurisdiction of the FDA to be safe and functional as durable medical equipment. And the maximum consideration right now is, will the insurance companies reimburse for attachments that would allow the chair to be more easily transported? And those options do exist in certain payment systems, but they haven't been built with this idea in mind of creating a truly independent way of securing the wheelchair.
Thanks for that answer, Henry. On a different look at accessibility, can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing would be, particularly in autonomous vehicles, for people who may be deaf or hard of hearing, or people who may be blind or low vision, in terms of interacting with the vehicles, and in terms of maybe sounds and color contrast, things like that?
I can jump in, or Josh, I see you coming on. Happy to let you go.
Oh, I mean, my answer is actually was going to be pretty similar to my previous one, is that part of these programs that we hosted, that we do have whole ones about passengers with sensory or cognitive disabilities. And so all I have to say is, yes, this is something being addressed, but I don't have all the specifics on hand.
And I would just quickly say, from our conversations with companies, they're talking about ways that the car is going to communicate with riders that are blind about the environment, where they are in space, and ways of making sure that deaf people can communicate with both the vehicle and the rider support system. So, text-based chat, there may be a display that provides some information for people that are deaf, but certainly for people that are blind, I think there will be options to have some in-car notifications about where the vehicle is in space.
Thanks, Henry, and Josh. Another question: where are companies at so far as getting wheelchairs into a consumer electric vehicle, so individually owned electric vehicles? And are accessibility companies able to modify an electric vehicle to accommodate somebody who's using a wheelchair or scooter?
I'm happy to take that one. I think that's definitely a consideration, and a goal of ours is there's a concept in accessibility called shift left, and it's we need to get as far ahead of the design process as we can. And with the transformation we've got going at General Motors, we have so much coming on the horizon for electric vehicles that having those conversations about what it takes for architecture to be wheelchair accessible, those conversations are something we are really excited to have with different groups at our company. And then just finding the right kind of representative models. I think that's been a really exciting challenge for us too, is we have kind of design references internally of all sorts of accessories that people bring into our vehicles. And when we took a look at it, some things are as old as like the hospital folding wheelchair that you see. But we've really worked to get a more representative model so that when we have these engineering discussions, it's as easy as a few clicks to really show what it takes to get like a quantum into what our architecture is. So that's been really exciting to kind of challenge our designers to start looking at and thinking of.
And is there any modification, like that new types of modifications that have to be done with batteries now being in the floor instead of being in the front of the car, and that being where ramps typically go? Are we seeing new ways to try to make sure that even if we have batteries in the floor, you can still put in ramps if we're whether it's built that way from the beginning or it's got to be modified?
Yeah, that's a great new challenge as well. And when we think of the future of kind of all modification of vehicles, safety suddenly becomes a new horizon as well, because these are really high voltage systems that you can't just drill into or cut out. So that's where our opportunity too is to get the folks who are doing that into our programs that are helping train and educate on the safety, so that we can do things the right way and support that ecosystem.
Speaking of you mentioned safety, Alan. We had a question about what happens if you're in one of these autonomous vehicles and unfortunately there's a crash or something, and now you need to be able to exit the vehicle and do in an emergency type situation. Is that something that's also being considered? Is how do we make sure those individuals are safe and can safely be removed? Because now there's nobody in the car who's driving it. Maybe it notifies somebody it's had an issue. I'm not sure how these vehicles will talk to their supporters, but have there been talks about what do you do if there is a safety issue and now it needs to be addressed?
Yeah, and another really great question that from our point of view with like what we're doing with General Motors and Cruise, we really have a focus on redundant systems so that if those situations do happen, there are kind of fallbacks and kind of tiers of service. And I think to speak to GM's strength of our partnership with Cruise is that telematics angle of we're one of the oldest companies that's really had in vehicle emergency services through OnStar, and through working with our partner like Cruise, they're able to bring some of that excellence to their systems and learn from us in our journey of bringing that customer support in those situations.
Thank you. We had a comment, and Josh, maybe you could provide a comment to this. Is so there's this individual, they have local trolleys and buses in their community, and wanted to know about suggesting options for wheelchairs and scooters to set sideways in a vehicle, as this being a safer position for a wheelchair user to be in. Josh, can you comment on that? Because you talked about orientation of the passenger.
Yeah, just a little bit in that I think absolutely if you're not secured, then it is going to definitely be safest to be facing not in the direction of travel, because then your wheelchair isn't going to slide back and forth or anything like that. But when it comes to actual securement forward facing really is the safest that studies have shown. So I don't think there's going to be a change to that when it comes to actual securement orientation.
All right, and our final question is EVs for purchase. We know that there is a lot of talk about this, particularly in the media recently, and are EVs generally available from most of the car manufacturers? I don't know, Henry, you do a lot of work through We Will Ride with various manufacturers. Are EVs readily available? And what about for wheelchair users?
I would just quickly say that I was noticing online that there was an advertisement from Chevy for the Chevy Blazer, and then their pickup also, that are all EV. And I think right now there's probably, they're taking orders. I think it's pretty difficult to buy an electric vehicle for direct purchase right now. Whether or not they're accessible, I think that's, an issue that hasn't been addressed yet. I don't know that, I think the aftermarket modifiers are working on it. Matter of fact, we've had conversations with Braun Ability and know that they are working on adaptations for electric vehicles, like for a minivan, to have a ramp system that operates when the battery is in the floor. So I hope that this will be able to answer this more clearly soon. But the electric vehicles are for sale. The accessibility features aren't really there yet. But stay tuned. I'm sure that's going to change.
Well, thank you to our presenters today for that discussion. It is exciting to see what the future may hold, and that we are trying to make sure that accessibility is baked in, so it does not have to be added later. So we thank you for joining us today. This is just the first of many conversations I know that we'll be having in the coming months and years about this form of transportation and trying to prove accessibility. So again, thank you to Henry and Alan and Josh. We appreciate your time today. The webinar was recorded, and the webinar and the slides will be available on PDA's website. If you registered for today's event, you will receive a link once it is posted. Do give us about a week or so as we do caption the video and everything before we do get it posted, but it will be online soon. So thank you again for your time today and for our presenters, and we'll see you on our next webinar. Thank you.